Hello everyone, welcome back to my show, The Interview. I'm your host, Susan Lee McDonald. Most foreigners' conception of the Korean wave, or Hallyu, is usually attributed to modern Korean culture, including K-pop, K-cuisine, and dramas. Our guest today is Professor Emanuel Pastreich, a professor at Kyung University who's been in Korea for over 7 years. Now, he's got some very interesting ideas about Korean culture and how to share that with the rest of the world. Join me as I interview Emanuel Pastreich. Hello and welcome to my show, Emanuel.
Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.
It's a pleasure.
And I'm so curious about a lot of the things that you do. I mean, you are not only a professor at Kyung University, but you seem to be putting your hands in a lot of different pots.
Yes.
So could you describe to me kind of what you are involved in?
Well, of course, I am teaching here. I've been writing quite a lot lately, both in Korean and in English. And I guess I would summarize it to say that there's just enormous potential in Korea in terms of its culture, in terms of the vibrant culture today, the sometimes undiscovered culture of the past, and moreover, that Korea is increasingly playing such an important role globally. People from all over the world are coming to benchmark Korea. It's a very exciting time to be here.
Yeah, definitely. And I know I love being here in Korea, and having been back in Korea for the past couple of years, it's just a really vibrant place to be. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. It's the place.
Yeah. Now, your focus as a professor at Kyung University is particularly what subject?
So my original field was basically novels, China, Japan, and Korea for the 17th, 18th century. But I ended up in the College of International Studies. So I teach a general introduction to Asian culture, China, Japan, and Korea, in English, culture and history. And then I also teach a class in public diplomacy, so international relations, with a focus on culture.
Well, you've studied a number of different Asian countries' cultures and literature and languages. Would you say that you're somewhat of an Asiaphile?
Well, you could say that. I didn't start with Korea, but Korea seems to be the best balance. If you do China, Japan, and Korea, you can enjoy a little bit of all those cultures here. And Korea has been sort of inspiring. I think maybe it comes from, of course, I'm not Asian originally at all, but there's a sense in a lot of the West today that the Western culture, civilization has lost some of its vitality, and that Asia has been blooming. And among all the countries in Asia, in terms of democracy, in terms of sort of an egalitarian, open society, Korea really has been the most impressive.
Definitely. So you studied East Asian literature, and you also, I would guess, had some impetus to study Asian literature from the get-go. What was that impetus?
Well, so there was a personal experience that's
Okay.
part of that. Although I'm from the Midwest in the United States, from St. Louis, and then I taught at University of Illinois, I went to high school in San Francisco, and my high school was probably about 75% Asian, so I had a lot of Asian friends back there, and I'm used to being minority from early on, feel comfortable around the Asians. And then when I went to university, I was thinking very hard about what to major in. And I thought that China seemed, even then, this is back in 1983 when dinosaurs roamed the earth. In those days,
So long ago, right?
so long ago, I thought that that there was some potential here in Asia. I wasn't sure exactly what it was, and then I got excited when I started to actually do the studies. So,
Now, with your interest in not only Korean culture and literature, we can't avoid the fact that you speak, what, 5 languages, is that right?
something like that. No, not perfectly, but I try.
So with those different languages, you must have some insight into how easy or difficult it is to pick up a non-Western language. So how would you suggest for people who want to study Asian languages or just multiple languages?
Right. So for all those of you who are not native speakers of English, I feel your pain. I know what it's like. I did my master's degree in Japanese. And I think the most important, there are 2 principles I would say. The first is you should not be afraid to repeat things. That it's better to take one paragraph and get it down perfectly than it is to try and read 100 pages. Because once you have some part of the language down perfectly, you can build on that much more easily than if you go too broadly, too early. And the second part is I think that environment is the most critical. So in the case of Korean, I came to Korea to study seriously when I was 31. So it was a bit late in my career and in my language acquisition skills. The way I did it was I decided I was not going to have any English-speaking friends for the first year. And that was a rough decision, right? I mean, I didn't speak Korean all that well, and it spent a lot of time alone.
That must have been difficult.
It was difficult, but by that time, having learned 3 languages before, I knew that you had to do that. Because if you end up in Korea and you're surrounded by either Koreans who speak to you in English or other foreigners who speak to you in English, your rate of learning is going to be much slower. So you would be better off finding some Korean, even if it's the ajumma from the umsikjang, from the local restaurant, who's willing to actually speak to you in Korean, than you are to just keep speaking English as you always have with your buddies. And I would say those are 2 essential elements.
I see. Switching topics just a little bit. You translated the short stories of Park Ji-won, and I'm curious that you decided to translate these short stories, these classical novels from the Joseon period. What was your inspiration for wanting to do that?
Well, I had enjoyed his novels. I read them when writing my dissertation. I thought that they had the most potential to appeal to a broad audience overseas. They have incredible depth and sophistication and some unique characteristics. For example, Park Ji-won made people of very low mimetic, sort of low class background as the protagonist. So he has stories in which the protagonist is a beggar or a poor farmer or sort of charlatan figures. And so he sort of shows the whole variety of Korean society from different perspectives. And this was truly unique. So I think his novels have this sort of quality that can be truly appreciated.
I imagine that it wasn't easy to translate that into English. and I'm curious how you managed to first do the translations, and do you feel like they were up to your satisfaction at the end?
Well, that's a very tough question. I would say they're not easy, and Park Ji-won's writings are inherently difficult. It's in literary Chinese with Hanmun, so it's not Korean at all. And he uses many terms which are Chinese in origin, but which were used for very specific meanings within the context of 18th century Seoul or Korea. So it's not always so easy to know exactly what he meant. And in many cases, I would look at the Korean contemporary translations in Hangul, but still was not totally clear what Park Ji-won meant. So I wish I could have spent another couple more years on the book myself, but I think we did reasonably well in terms of getting the essence of the stories.
Now, it seems that you're more interested in classical literature as opposed to modern literature. And would you consider yourself a more classical, traditional person?
I'm less qualified to speak meaningfully about contemporary Korean literature. I think that's accurate. I'm interested in contemporary Korean culture in general, or society in general, but my tendency has been to say, these are these tremendous institutions of the Chosun period. How can we bring them up to date and use them in contemporary society? That's been really the way in which I've looked at the past.
I see. From my understanding, you really like to look into Korean culture and Korean history, Korean literature, and bring that to a more modern audience.
Exactly.
Why is it that you really look to the past to bring to the present?
Right. Well, that's exactly what I would say is the approach. It's something like the Renaissance model. So if you looked at, say, Italy, Florence, in the 16th century, they said, let's go back to the past of Rome and Greece, to this great tradition. But in fact, if you see what they did, say what Michelangelo does in the Sistine Chapel, in fact, they did things which were totally unprecedented. I mean, those buildings are not like anything that the Romans or Greeks had built. So I think if you look at Korea today, it has reached a very high level of sophistication in terms of technology, and in terms of culture and cultural production, and in terms of systems, administration, very, very sophisticated. And so the question is, the next level would be to say, how can they come together as a sort of a totality in the sense that not only Korea is going to be a more advanced country, but to create sort of a new civilization. And to do that, which I think Korea has the potential, requires you to go back and find your own tradition. It can't be importing some other culture. It has to come back to where did it begin.
You know, I think that the idea of drawing from past experiences, and learning from either past mistakes or from past successes, is so important to helping to guide the present and the future. And by what you're saying, it seems like it's a real passion of yours to make sure that people nowadays know what's going on or what has gone on in the past.
Right.
Why do you feel so passionate about that?
Well, I think it's not just a Korea issue. It's a global issue. There's the anthropologist Jared Diamond. He recently wrote a book called "The Way We Lived Before Yesterday," I think it was, and basically he talks about the incredible know-how in traditional societies and how we can apply that to the present day. In the Korean case, we have, for example, Koreans go to Germany to learn about eco-cities, and they think, well, we can learn something from Germany or Sweden or Finland. But in fact, Seoul, Hanyang, was one of the most sophisticated eco-cities in the world, with almost 100% recycling, incredible efforts to retain soil, and as you know, things like human waste at all, were all 100% recycled into the farming process, which we don't do anymore, although we probably should. So
and it's looked upon as just unsanitary.
That's
too,
right, which is a total mistake. It was an incredibly smart system to do. So the question is, if we wanted to go back to something like that, we dispose of our waste in a way which actually helps our society and preserves the environment, we don't have to go somewhere else, right? We just have to go and look at the past here in Korea.
Now, you're currently living in Korea, and you've lived in different parts of Asia, yes? Japan and China, and also Taiwan.
Correct.
So, despite the fact that these countries have had a long history together, thousands of years, there are significant differences between the three of them, or four, including Taiwan. And what is your opinion of how Korea situated, not just geopolitically, but from a cultural standpoint?
Right. Well, so Korea is a distinctly vital part of Asia. I think we can say very clearly that culture emanates from Korea and radiates out. That didn't used to be the case. I mean, 30 years ago, new fashions or literature would start in Tokyo and sort of percolate and spread out through Asia. But now, really, I think Seoul is, I don't know, ground zero is the right word for it, but it starts, often it starts here, like somewhere,
the hub.
somewhere there in Shinsadong, right, is where some new culture sort of bubbles up and then spreads out. So it has that sort of vitality. Why? I think there are two elements. One would be to say that there's a great cultural flexibility in Korea because the Korean War and things got mixed up in a way. So I mean, it's some sadness in that story, but Korea has a sort of vitality. People went from the bottom to the top, from top to the bottom. And the other aspect is, at the same time that Korea has been mixed up a lot, it's also retained much of the traditional culture to a degree that you don't find in other countries. So the purest forms of Buddhism, like we talked about, Haeinsa, it was preserved here in Korea. And the Confucian tradition too, Sungkyung Gwan, basically much of the Confucian tradition without much of a break has been carried on to the present.
Here we are at an international school located in Seoul, where Emanuel Pastreich was invited as a guest teacher. And while you might think that he might be teaching about East Asian literature, surprisingly, he was here to teach about Buddhism.
Today, when we try and learn the original Buddhist texts, although they were originally written in Sanskrit and Pali, the texts that survive in the original Sanskrit.
So when I first met him, he came up with some ideas. He was like, I'd like to be of help with the school. And he told me about his past and background knowledge he's got. He just brings a level of expertise that myself as a classroom teacher I don't have. We have a pretty short time to cover a massive amount of time in history. And so he brings a totally different ballgame to the classroom and gives a more in-depth look at Buddhism.
Buddhism was not promising you will feel no pain, right? It's assuming that pain is a part of all human experience. Buddhist texts, but there were many of them. Some of them.
It was natural for Emanuel, who had been studying East Asian literature for decades, to become intrigued by this culture. And he says that it brings him great joy to impart his knowledge to future generations.
And so many people came, they learned about this Buddhist teachings, and they traveled from China to India. Xuanzang is from the Tang Dynasty, is one of the most famous, but there were many of them. Some of them
die, you get born again like an animal or snake. And we follow Buddhist teachings. Is it a bad thing?
That is an excellent question. That is an excellent question.
I think it's better because because some Asians tell about Buddhism that Buddhism is very good, and he's kind of neutral about Buddhism. So
I've never heard an American teaching an Asian religion, and I'm thankful for the presentation and that he's a good presenter.
While it isn't common for students in Korea to learn about Eastern culture from a Westerner, and that, I'm sure, made this experience all the more memorable for them. Now, switching topics just a little bit more for a personal look into your life, Emanuel. You've lived in Korea now total for 7 years, is that right?
Almost 7 years.
Okay. And when you first came to Korea, what was your impression? I hear that your impression of Korea at first wasn't all that positive.
Well, so the first time I came to Korea was not actually to live, but to visit. Yeah, it was pretty rough. People were not that friendly. I had a lot of trouble speaking to Koreans because a lot of Koreans, they just feel inherently nervous when they talk to non-Koreans.
That was in 91, is that right?
That was in 91
Okay.
first time. I
Okay.
couldn't get good coffee, as you know. The world has changed a lot. Now you
Coffee is that important to you, yes?
well, I mean, you know how Korea has changed in that respect, even in the last 3 or 4 years. So it was difficult at first, yes.
So I do want to talk about how you found it so interesting to really go deeper into Korean culture and history to find out that, you know, even way back in the Joseon Dynasty period, people were planning for the future, you know,
Right.
for 100 years
Absolutely right.
into the future.
Absolutely right.
But with your coming to Korea and deciding to more or less be here for an extended period of time, what was it that you found particularly attractive about being here?
Well, I think Korea is a relatively open society, and one of the most open societies in the world. Often that makes Korea seem less open because all the bad things about Korea are broadcast in the newspaper. But I think that's positive. I mean, that tells you just how transparent a society it is. I think it has enormous amount of cultural vitality, people able to innovate. I worked, to give an example, I worked with Chungnam Province. And Chungnam, as you may know, Daejeon used to be the capital of Chungnam, and then when Daejeon reached a certain population, they made it a metropolitan city, has a mayor rank of a governor,
Yes.
and then they moved the capital of Chungnam to Hongseong. In the case of the United States, that sort of change, I think, hasn't happened in the last 100 years. It's not really possible. Or if you take AirX to Incheon Airport. I mean, they've been trying to put a high-speed train from Manhattan to Kennedy Airport for the last 45 years and haven't been able to do it. But Koreans, they're able to do things, and that sort of, you know, willingness to actually have, you know, ambitious, far-reaching ideas, but at the same time to actually be able to implement them, that's what's really exciting about Korea for us.
When you've written your books, you've written them mostly in Korean, yes? And they're, of course, published in Korean. And I'm curious about your fascination with geomancy, or in Korean known as pungsu. Why were you focused on geomancy, and what was the attraction there?
Well, it's a fascinating topic. In pungsu, or feng shui as they say in Chinese, geomancy, it's tended to be in recent years the way you place the graves of people, right? So Koreans have tended to think about, you know, for good luck, you want to arrange your grave in a certain way relative to north and south and relative to the surrounding environment.
And that's because your offspring and the people that come after you will gain benefits on some level.
If you're planning your own grave,
right.
often you're planning someone else's grave from before, but basically the concept is in order to carry on that good luck for your family, you have to have your grave well placed.
Yes.
And this is part of geomancy, of pungsu, but it's only part. It had originally basically had to do with the flow of water, the flow of air, soil, and the relationship between different parts of the ecosystem and human communities. So it actually originally was what we call ecology.
Yes.
That was the essence of pungsu. Unfortunately, in many Korean cities, essentially we've ignored that tradition. So we use it when we're designing tombs, but we don't use it when we're designing cities, right? But in fact, the great wisdom and the great potential in that tradition is not in how to design graves, which really, except for dead people, are not really part of our daily lives, but rather how do we create ecologically sound cities which can breathe hope, as we say in Korean, right? Breathe and interact with the natural world. And the traditional hanok houses, traditional architecture, city planning, of the past offers that potential for human communities which are in harmony with nature itself.
When you talk about geomancy and feng shui, a lot of people will think about how to place certain objects even within the home.
Right.
In addition to where to bury one's parents or ancestors. And while that's important to some extent, and there's some wisdom in that, your focus on feng shui or pungsu, geomancy as ecology is quite interesting, because that's something that has been carried on for hundreds and hundreds of years in the past, but has essentially been really filtered down to something that is much more superficial on some level. And I'm curious how you address that in your book, and how you would like to help people to change their ideas of what pungsu is.
Right. So my purpose in the book is not to become an expert on pungsu, right? But rather to make the contribution that I can make. And that is to highlight some parts which have been ignored or downplayed in recent years. So that's really what I'm coming at it from. I would say that Korea has its own unique sort of pungsu tradition, in some ways quite different than what you find in China and Japan, and that in Korea is the potential, as is the case in, say, traditional Oriental medicine, for the redefinition of geomancy, ecology, traditional ecology, or redefinition of traditional medicine, to create a wave which will not only change Korea, but transform the way, say, traditional culture is seen in Japan, China, and around the world. So it could start here.
Emanuel, in your book, the newest book here, you talk about Hallyu. Now, Hallyu has typically been considered more K-pop, entertainment-driven, but you also address it as globalizing the Korean Thanksgiving, as well as making Korean villages much more international, and making them into the Provence of Asia. And it's very interesting when you talk about that, because that's something that not many people have addressed.
Right, so that's the real potential, I think. If you go to, say, I lived in Chungnam, of course, for 4 years, and I was always struck at how much the landscape, maybe it's more beautiful than Provence in some respects. There's a lot of delicious traditional foods there, but the issue has been that the villages they haven't been really kept that neat and clean. And people haven't really made an effort to preserve traditional architecture so much. But if they did, if Korea did, I think a lot of these rural areas could be enormously popular in the way that Provence is. And that would mean, I mean, for example, you go to, if you get like Tanjang or Gochujang or what else, Cheonggukjang, right? Or Makgeolli. If you went to a place and they said, well, we have this tradition, we've been making doenjang for 500 years, and you had a beautiful old house made of wood where they made it, and you took a tour there, and you could spend the night at the inn there, and it was a beautiful sort of traditional environment. I think it has enormous potential, enormous potential.
Now, with a lot of the things that you address in your book, you definitely talk about how you look at Korea from a different perspective than what a Korean would. And not only because you are not Korean, but what is it about you that makes you look at Korea in a different perspective?
Well, I think Korea is extremely important to me personally. So I do care about Korea. But I think maybe the difference from many other foreigners, Americans who spent time in Korea here, is that I see the potential to be here, right? That the real potential to make new culture, new civilization, new opportunities, that Korea is growing and is becoming very sophisticated very, very quickly. So I would say to all of our viewers who are interested in opportunities that I just don't find any place more appealing, more fascinating. So it's not an accident that it's not because I like kimchi per se that I'm in Korea as opposed to in Japan or China. I just found this sort of vitality and that's palpable here.
In your books, you constantly kind of remind Koreans that they need to rediscover, and we've spoken about this a little bit before, about rediscovering the past and bringing it into the future. What are some technological advances from, let's say, the Joseon period that people should really take a serious look at to see that Korea's development wasn't just in the past 60 years.
Absolutely.
And that it really was based from ancient traditions.
Right.
And of course, Korea came from the ravages of war to become what it is now through various means. But technology was always very important. How do you show that in your book to people?
Right. So of course, Korea was a center for technology in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, and even later than that in many respects. But my book is not so much about, say, ancient technologies per se, but rather the technology of how you run systems. And the Joseon, which lasted for 500 years in a relatively peaceful environment in which there was this very strong sort of balance of power between the different institutions, and a relatively open environment. People could criticize the king. They were able to sort of interact in a way which is hard to find actually in that period of time. This is very impressive. And some of the traditions, for example, the annals of the Joseon dynasty, the system in which you kept accurate records, or the whole tradition of propriety, what they call yeha, which was this idea, know-how, for how to maintain good relations and be respectful to a large range of different people from different backgrounds. That was in the Joseon, was about how to interact with your family and also within government or within institutions. But I think with a bit of creativity, we can take much of that knowledge and apply it to, say, the issue of cyberspace, right, or social networks. How do we maintain relations that are proper, right? Because cyber world or social networks take you in all different directions with people you don't really know all that well. So much of that knowledge, which is now asleep from the Joseon dynasty, I think can be reinterpreted and used today.
History is usually written by those who are in power, and the losers don't usually have a say in what the history is about. So when we are looking at the annals of the Joseon dynasty, for example, we're looking at people's lives and the details of everything that's gone on. But those are the winners that have written. Now, in going to where we are in present day, we have different media reporting on what's happening. So we have a lot of different sources of information of what is history. What do you say to a new or modern form of annals of the Joseon dynasty, but annals of the Korean government or U.S. government?
Right. Well, it's a fascinating, this is one of my favorite topics. Unfortunately, it's a little bit protein in my mind because I've only started writing on this very recently. As you know, I wrote only last week on an article on the topic. But I think the potential is enormous. The potential is enormous. So if you had, I mean, today in this internet age, it's so hard to figure out what is accurate, and you get all these different sources for information. So to set up a sort of a system whereby you accurately record what happens in a reliable way, I think it's going to be something for which there will be tremendous demand globally, and that if Korea could set a sort of a model for how that could be done, which is grounded in its own tradition, that could be a model not just for how Korea is run. And here, maybe I'll say something a little critical of Korea. There's a sad story about Korea, and that is that Korea has been an incredibly innovative country, but often that hasn't really taken off in the way it could have. So Korea was the first country to develop metal movable type, for example, but although it was the first, it didn't become a global standard and essentially was lost as a technology. So that was sad. We had the same story with Cyworld, which was the first social network system, very, very advanced, 2003, 2004. But ultimately, it was Facebook and not Cyworld that was able to create a sort of a global standard for how social networks would work. So I think the critical issue, if we're looking back at things like Pungsu geomancy or the annals of the Chosun dynasty or other institutions is that this time it's not just for Korea, but it's a global standard that we would be creating.
It sounds like, unlike a lot of people who do come to Korea and enjoy, living in Korea, that you've done a lot of research. I mean, it sounds like you read quite a lot to be able to gain a lot of the expertise on these various subjects. How important is reading about Korean history and culture to you?
Well, so reading is extremely important. I wouldn't say I now do things like shows like this, so I don't read as intensely as I once did. I used to basically read all day long. But I would say for those who want to learn Korean or foreign languages, the reading is essential, that you should, I would say, force yourself to read constantly and read broadly, because that's the only way you can get that sort of real cultural depth. And one of the dangers is, if you go in Korea, if you just go with the sort of the surface flow of Gangnam style or fashionable clothes, that you miss some of these long-term factors which are decisive in terms of how Korea has developed so far and how it will develop going forward. Korea is about potential. There's tremendous potential here, I think, to create new systems, new culture, new lives, and a new civilization for our world. That potential is what draws us here, and I think that's what draws people from around the world to look to Korea for inspiration. It's my country. My children have grown up here. They speak Korean, and all around me is Korea. So we're looking at Korea from the inside. It is the inner view. How did I meet my wife? This is personal. Okay, well, yeah. So my wife was a major in Korean music, and I was very drawn to her because we both saw the potential in Korea's traditional culture. And I was working on Korean literature, and she was working on Korean music. Now she works more on Korean art, but we're both interested in trying to introduce Korean culture to the world.
You have 2 children and a lovely wife, who you mentioned is very much into the Buddhist art and whatnot. I'd love to learn a little bit more about your family.
Well, you just mentioned my family. My wife is, of course, is studying right now, writing her master's thesis. My son, who's in middle school now, came here when he was 6, and he has great interest in science, in fact, picking up the long Korean tradition back to Sejong. And my daughter, I think, is more of an artist. She likes to draw quite a lot. They've both been, my son has been in both Korean and international schools. My daughter has been basically in Korean schools the whole time.
That's very interesting that you have 2 children who are going to 2 very different kinds of school systems. How did you choose, or did they choose to go to those different schools?
I think it had to do, my son had gone, and this is not just me, many Koreans also who have children in school in places like the United States and come back had the same problem. If the children are too old, they have a lot of trouble adapting to Korean education. My daughter was 2 years old when she came, so I think it was very natural. This is what she's accustomed to. But my son, much harder. So he spent year and a half in Korean school, but it was very difficult for him.
With your children, I imagine that you and your wife have talked to them about being biracial here in Korea. How do you address that topic with such young children?
It's an incredibly difficult issue, I think. I don't really want to dwell on that topic per se. One critical issue is that those aspects of Korean culture which are unique or are worthy should be seen as universals. They're not about being Korean per se. And I have always stressed that with my children. But I've also stressed with them that people are blind. They don't do these mean things to you because they want to be mean. They literally cannot see or they cannot empathize with what your position is.
Now going and talking a little bit more about you personally, Emanuel,
Yes.
I understand that in addition to your given name, that you have a Korean name, Emanuel, and what is the meaning of Man-yeol, and how did you come about with that name?
Well, so in reverse, I received the name from my father-in-law just about the time that I got married in 1997. And I think it was a ritual becoming part of that family, of the E family, so it's now my family. The words, man means many, and yeol is sort of emotion, it's a yeoljeong, right? So passion. So that was the origin of the term, but of course it's closest to my name, Emanuel.
I see. But it's also meaning a man of many passions. Yes.
It has that significance to it, and it is, of course, my Korean name. So when I'm in Korea, I in most cases, when in Korea, you should follow Korean customs.
With your being able to see so many different perspectives and having lived in different countries, different Asian countries in particular, it seems that you have a much easier time of being able to step into another culture's shoes, another perspective. Do you feel that that's something that's important for you to pass down to your children?
Absolutely. Maybe it's the essential issue, right? How one adapts, and I have also come to feel that although we're most aware of it when we're entering another country, it's true within our own countries, right? That there are these different cultures. There's a culture of journalism. It's different than academics and different from business or government, and so we should be very aware of these different cultures that exist and think very carefully about how we craft our message so that it can be meaningful and implementable in these different cultures.
Emanuel, as a dad living in Korea, and the educational fervor that most Koreans have, which is really unlike a lot of other places on the planet.
Yes.
What are some of your thoughts on the Korean educational system and the super competitive nature? Is this something that you want to help foster in your kids? Is this something that you find important to address with your children as well?
Well, I have mixed feelings about the education in Korea. Obviously, the extremely high level of education in general is impressive. The part that I'm most impressed with and that I'd like to emulate around the world is the way in which all Koreans have a high level of education. There are no groups in Korean that are illiterate or really unable to function in the language, which is not true for other countries, including the United States. So it's truly impressive. But there have been some real problems with Korean education as well.
And you've written about that in your books too.
I have. Maybe the most serious has been this focus on a very narrow sense of what knowledge is. Certain kinds of knowledge only count. And specifically, many children, sadly, spend years and years studying for exams, but the emphasis has been just on passing exams. And because of the way you learn, which is not interactive, the memories are short-term.
Yes.
So once you've taken the test and 5 years has passed, you've forgotten most of what you learned. So I think there's tremendous possibility in Korea, and I'm very impressed by much of the education system here. So I'm not critical across the board, but I think if education became more interactive, so you took the information you learned and you made something with it, or you thought about how the world works, that we could create in our children memories that would last a lifetime rather than being so much just once the test is gone, it sort of fades away.
Now, as a father of 2 children, and you just mentioned that interactive education is really important, what would be an aspect of interactive education? How would we see that?
Right, so interactive would be in the sense that you learn some principle of, say, mathematics or physics, and then you go in your neighborhood and you do a little study, and you say, this is how electricity runs through the house, right? Or how water flows in my neighborhood, or things like that. Or you take it, I mean, the best way to create long-term memories, this is more physiological, is multiple mediums. So you learn, you hear it, you see it, you write it, you smell it, touch it, and you do it in multiple dimensions. The more different ways, tactile, that you approach the information, the more likely you will be able to remember it long term.
In addition to being an author and also a father,
most important,
a husband, and a professor, you also are the director of the Asia Institute.
Yes.
I'd love to learn a little bit more about what you do there.
So the Asia Institute is a think tank here now in Seoul. We have been running since 2007. Our primary interest has been in creating an active discussion on issues that many think tanks have not focused on so much.
Such as?
Well, how technology has changed the world and how our society is changing, environmental issues and the future of the environment, and aspects of international relations which tend to be overlooked, like technology or media, for example. Moreover, in many of our interactions, we've tried to bring in high school students, college students, young people, to have them interact, participate. When we did the interview, for example, the seminar with Professor Noam Chomsky, we had many college students there who asked him questions directly and sort of got him into a direct dialogue. So very important for us to give a chance for young people to be involved in the decision-making, the policy process.
Last but not least, if you had to say something about how you wish Korea would change in the future, what would you say?
So there's a good answer I have for this question, and that is that Koreans need to realize that the Korean wave, how Koreans live their life, is impacting the entire world. People in Southeast Asia, in China, in Central Asia, and the Middle East, they benchmark Korea for how they run their governments. They watch Korean TV to think about how they should live their lives. If the Korean wave that we create is one which inspires a peaceful society and an equal and fair society, a society in which people are concerned about the environment and about the future, then all these people who are exposed to the Korean wave will follow in that, and it can create a new civilization and a bright future for us. If we don't do that, if Korean wave is about consuming, if it's about selfishness, if it's about just looking out for yourself and having a good time, that has consequences that go far beyond the 50 million people here in South Korea. So that sort of awareness for young people in Korea to think that what they do on a daily basis has that much importance for the world, that's what I really would like to see.
Emanuel, it's been such a pleasure to have you on my show, The Interview, and to hear about how you're really learning so much about the past to bring it to the present and future. And I really wish you all the best with your future books and your Asia Institute and all the students who are impacted by your teaching. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
No problem. Take care.
Thank you.